Okay, Carrie, I'm going to get started.
Great.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We have Dr. Carrie Bearden with us, who received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and joined the UCLA faculty in 2003. Currently, she is a professor of George and Joanne Miller Family Term Chair in the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA with a joint appointment in the Department of Psychology. Dr. Bearden's research aims to understand neurobiological risk factors for the development of psychosis using converging methods to study cognition and neuroanatomy in clinical high-risk samples. For example, adolescents at clinical high risk for psychosis, and in highly penetrant genetic subtypes of the illness. She also leads and co-directs research projects and programs many of them in the neuroscience field. Today, Dr. Bearden will discuss factors associated with increased risk for mood disorders in adolescents. These will include brain maturation and sleep circadian changes that occur during this time period, and implications for treatment will also be discussed. Welcome, Carrie. We're really happy to have you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. Thanks for that very kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me to speak for this webinar. The webinars are a little challenging in the sense that I can't see the audience. I can't see whether this is making sense to you all, but I look forward to the opportunity to take questions at the end, and so hopefully we'll be able to answer any questions that you do have. So I'll be talking today about risk and resilience to mood disorders in teens, and I want to start just by thanking the International Bipolar Foundation and suggesting that everyone make a donation to the foundation. So just as an outline of the presentation today, I'm going to start with an overview of the concept of brain plasticity and vulnerability in adolescence and how this might be a risk factor for the development of mood disorders during this period. I'll talk a little bit about cognitive difficulties in youth with bipolar disorder and the effects these challenges can have on social relationships and education, and then some about comorbidities and how that also can affect one's cognitive abilities, ability to function in school, and so forth. And then I'll tell you a little bit about our study we have going on in Latin America right now in youth with that are children of bipolar parents, and particularly about sleep disruption and how we think that might be relevant to the development of mood disorders. And then finally, some potential interventions that could be applied. So the changes that occur in the teenage brain are something that we are really just beginning to appreciate in terms of the degree of extensive remodeling and rewiring of the brain that goes on during adolescence. And we've known for many years about this period of remarkable plasticity in infancy and early childhood. But in recent years, there's been a huge upsurge of interest in what goes on in the brain during adolescence. And it's become increasingly clear that there's an incredible structural reorganization of the brain that goes on during this time period that's analogous to this developmental window of increased plasticity that occurs in infancy. So what are some of these structural changes? Well, we view adolescence as a time of both incredible potential as well as incredible vulnerability. So there are these standard changes that occur in the brain in the gray matter. And so the gray matter are really what we consider the brain cells in the brain, which are typically overproduced early in development. And then across development and during adolescence, there's what's called a process of synaptic pruning that results in increased efficiency of the brain, but eliminates about 40% of these cortical synapses. There are also changes in the white matter. We can think about the white matter as sort of like the internet of the brain. It's the fibers that connect these different brain regions. And so in typical brain development, your brain is continuing to myelinate all the way up until about age 50. So your brain is developing this increased efficiency over this time period. So the first areas of the brain to mature are those with the most basic functions, such as those processing senses and movement and the development of basic attention, vigilance, and alertness between the ages of about 3 and 6. Then in the ages of about 7 to 15, we see a growth spurt in these brain regions here, the temporal and parietal lobes, and this is critical for the development of language functions as well as mathematical ability. And then some of the latest structures to mature are in the frontal regions of the brain, and this occurs between the ages of about 16 to 20, where we actually see this tissue loss due to this synaptic pruning process. And this is really relevant to our ability to increase self-control, our ability to plan and regulate our behavior. So the adolescent age period is often characterized as a health paradox because it's a time of extensive increases in physical and mental capabilities, and yet there is this increase in overall mortality and morbidity, which is often due to preventable causes like risk-taking, substance abuse, and so forth. And so this asynchrony in developmental time courses between what we think of as an affective or approach system and our cognitive control brain systems. So these two things are at odds, and this really may lead to an increased vulnerability for risk-taking in adolescence. And so we think that this process of prefrontal cortical maturation, particularly of brain regions called the dorsolateral and the orbitofrontal regions, is assumed to correspond to the development of higher-level cognitive processes. Now, at the same time, there's this asynchrony because the maturing of our subcortical brain systems, so those beneath the cortex, like the nucleus accumbens, which is really critical for reward processing, are disproportionately activated relative to top-down control systems in adolescence. So we think this is really relevant to how these systems may go awry during adolescence and be related to, possibly related to increased mood lability and a risk for mood disorders during this time period. And so you can see when you look at prevalence rates of mood disorders in children, first of all, it's about twice as high in girls as it is in boys. So this is important. And then secondly, it almost doubles the rate of mood disorders going from pre-pubertal children to pubertal age children, the ages of 12 to 15. And then this gets even more dramatic when we look at the rates of mood disorders over the adolescent period. And you can see these rates really increase, as almost 1 in 4 having experienced a mood disorder episode by age 17 or 18. So something is really happening during this adolescent period. Now, what are the specific kinds of cognitive difficulties that we see in people with bipolar disorder? And so this is actually a study that I did several years ago with my colleague David Glahn. This was, in fact, looking at adults. So we'll start here just so you can get a sense of where we tend to see the biggest cognitive challenges. And so we're looking at a measure of effect size, of the size of the deficit in people with bipolar disorder diagnoses compared to demographically similar, the same age, same sex matched healthy individuals. And this is showing us that compared to people without bipolar disorder, people who have the diagnosis have really pronounced difficulties in the area of processing speed. So being able to process information very quickly, attention, problem solving, these are also challenges, whereas things like overall IQ really tend to be not impaired. And so this study, as I mentioned, was done in adults, but now I'll show you some of the work we've done in kids, and you can see, in fact, the profiles look quite similar. And so this is looking at pediatric bipolar spectrum disorders. This is a meta-analysis in which data are combined across a number of studies comparing adolescents with bipolar disorder to healthy controls. And you can see here that the largest differences are really in terms of verbal memory. So this is, for example, being able to hear a list of words or a story and be able to repeat it back. There are also difficulties in attention, executive function, so that involves things like novel problem solving. Working memory, a great example of working memory is being able to hear a phone number and be able to retain that in your mind and then punch it into your phone. That's something that children with bipolar disorder tend to have some trouble with. And so a little less so for things like visual memory, verbal fluency, being able to generate words quickly, but these are still somewhat impaired compared to children that don't have bipolar disorder. And the other thing is that the picture is now pretty consistent, regardless of whether individuals with pediatric bipolar disorder are medicated or whether they're euthymic, in other words, not having any mood symptoms at the time. Whether they're euthymic or acutely ill, these domains tend to be the ones that you see impairment in. Now, as you would expect, these difficulties have a significant impact on how one does socially and academically, and having an early onset of illness may be associated with even more severe persistent social dysfunction than adult onset illness. And we do see for children with early onset bipolar disorder, there is substantial impairment across interpersonal domains in terms of relationships with peers, siblings, and parents. Not surprising, but one study by Barbara Geller was interesting in finding that youth with bipolar disorder have lower social competence, more aggression, higher levels of social withdrawal, and even more frequent teasing than same-age peers with ADHD. So even compared to children with another psychiatric disorder, these youth with bipolar disorder are having a lot of difficulties socially. And the social behavior, as you might expect, could be negatively impacted by these broader cognitive deficits. And children with bipolar disorder do tend to have poor academic functioning, which is not surprising, but we do see that these deficits in attention, working memory, and organization and problem-solving skills contribute to these academic difficulties. So when we look at the rates of psychiatric comorbidity in bipolar youth stratified by the age of onset of illness, you can see that those with a childhood onset of illness have higher rates of ADHD, as well as oppositional defiant disorder in particular, compared to those with an adolescent onset. But those with adolescent onset tend to have higher rates of substance abuse disorders. Now, what does the cognitive profile in pediatric bipolar disorder look like? So these, what we're looking at on this figure is average Z-scores. And so the black is showing you for healthy controls. So they're normed at 0. So 0 is average. And so you can see that those in blue here are, these in blue are children with bipolar 2 disorder. So they're less impaired than those shown in red, those with bipolar 1 disorder. And interestingly, in this study, they did not find that comorbid ADHD was associated with significantly poorer cognitive performance. So it actually didn't make a difference whether one had ADHD or not. So moving on now to other key developmental changes that occur in adolescence, sleep patterns are really critical, and this is something that changes in terms of normal development. So newborns sleep for about 16 to 18 hours. Of course, if you've had a newborn, you know that they sleep in very short 3 to 4 hour periods. And average sleep at age 5 is about 11 hours, whereas in adolescence, there's this big shift where nighttime sleep reduces from about 9 hours at age 13 to less than 8 hours at age 16. There are also circadian changes in adolescence. So there's a delay in circadian phase and sleep onset, often shifting past midnight. There's also this shift where adolescents may not be tired until later on in the evening. At the same time, it's kind of a paradox because there's an increased biological need for sleep associated with pubertal development. So while your adolescent may not be so tired earlier in the evening, they need to sleep more, and so often they end up with a big sleep debt and sleep longer on the weekends. So there has been what's been called an inadequate sleep epidemic in adolescence, and so this is not just referring to children with bipolar illness or mental health disorder. Nationwide, almost 70% of students reported insufficient sleep on an average school night, which is quite substantial. And we also know that poor sleep is associated with poor academic performance for adolescents from middle school through college. Insufficient sleep is also associated with higher rates of current substance abuse, risky behavior, sadness, and suicidal ideation. And many of us, I think myself included, often feel like grumpy cat, where the worst thing after waking up is everything until I go to bed again. And hopefully, you know, not every day, but this is certainly what I think a lot of adolescents feel like. And eveningness, this is another important factor here, is that eveningness, or a tendency to be a night owl, is a risk factor for mood dysregulation. Also, sleep variability is something that's becoming increasingly clear as a risk factor for mood dysregulation. So if you're getting very different amounts of sleep from one night to the next. And so in a study of, this was a study of over 6,000 adolescents, this study found that eveningness, in other words, wanting to, a tendency to go to sleep later, wake up later, was associated with more daytime sleepiness, more attention problems, poor school achievement, more injuries, more emotional upset, and sleep disturbance. And again, on a sleep habit survey, which was administered to a large number of high school students, students who slept less than 6 hours and 45 minutes on school nights, or had a greater than 2-hour weekend bedtime delay. So in other words, they're going to sleep at 10 on a school night and midnight on the weekend, reported increased daytime sleepiness, depressive mood, and sleep-wake behavior problems. So it turns out that it's not just chronic sleep deprivation, but also changes in daily sleep that are related to daily variability and mood. And this study was from my colleague Andrew Fellini, where he had students, high school students, do a diary every day. And what they found was that studying and stressful demands during the day were modestly but consistently associated with less sleep that evening. And so receiving less sleep at night, in turn, was modestly but consistently related to higher levels of anxiety, depressive feelings, and fatigue the next day. And so daily variability in adolescent sleep time was notable, and this sleep deviation, so how much variability there is in your sleep, was associated with increased anxiety, depression, and fatigue, lower rates of happiness. Again, these correlations are modest, but they're still significant. So there are several lines of evidence for a central role of sleep and circadian disturbance in bipolar disorder. We know that sleep disturbances are among the most prominent correlates of mood episodes and also of inadequate recovery in bipolar patients, and also that impaired sleep can both induce and potentially predict manic episodes. So we also know, of course, that there's a cyclic nature to manic and depressed states, and a diurnal mood variation for many individuals with mood disorders. There is a mouse model that was originally developed by Colleen McClung, where there's a knockout of a circadian gene, the clock gene, that was basically showed some what were considered manic-like behaviors, which interestingly could be reversed with lithium treatment. So this is kind of an interesting model and suggests that circadian disruption may be a major factor in the pathophysiology of bipolar disorder. And so this is a hypothesized model of sleep deprivation as a proximal cause for mania. So here we can see that a variety of events, whether it's environmental, medical, physical, a variety of events can lead to sleep disruption, insomnia, sleep deprivation. Again, it could be caused by schedule changes, shift work, going out late, and so forth. Whatever the immediate cause, leading to sleep reduction, which can then cycle or trigger an episode of mania. And so the last part of the webinar, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we've been learning in our study of families with bipolar disorder in Latin America. And so this is a very interesting population. We've been working with families in the Central Valley of Costa Rica and this area surrounding Medellin, Colombia. It's a very interesting history of this region. These were genetically isolated populations that were established in the 16th and 17th century, largely by Spanish explorers who came to the region who had children with native Amerindian women. And there was this pattern of exponential growth from a small number of founders, and so you essentially got this population bottleneck. And so we've studied 26 of these very large families that have very high rates of severe bipolar disorder, and this tends to be a very psychotic form of bipolar 1 disorder, but there's also rates of depression and bipolar 2 disorder in the other family members. And so thus far, we've studied about 750 individuals in these families, 530 we've also done neuroimaging studies of, and we've also been collecting actigraphy data, which I'll tell you a little bit more about what that looks like. And so in these studies, what we tried to do was to study the branches of the family that would be most genetically informative. So this is one of the pedigrees, and the black colored in, the squares are males and the circles are females, and the black colored in squares are those that have bipolar disorder. And so you can see that in some branches of the family there are multiple individuals with the bipolar disorder diagnosis. And so whenever possible, we studied the affected individuals as well as their siblings, their children, and the parents if available. So we had these multi-generational families participating in the project. And so we were very interested, based on what I just told you, in looking at activity and circadian rhythm traits in these families. And so we had them wear these watches. They look like regular watches, but you actually get a lot more information from them, these active watches. They're also very expensive. But in any case, this is just a readout that we got from one person. We had the individuals wear these watches for a 2-week period, and we try to get 10 days of data just looking at their activity and sleep patterns. And so what you can see is that the black is the measure of their activity during the day, and then you can see that this here, where there's very little activity, is a rest period. So essentially where the person is sleeping, they may have had a little disturbance in there where they were up, and the yellow line is ambient light. And so from these actigraphy measures, we can get a lot of information. We can look at intradaily variability, so how variable is their schedule, how stable is their activity from day to day, from hour to hour. We can look at how long it takes them to fall asleep, a sleep onset latency, sleep duration, as well as sleep quality and efficiency based on how much disruption, how much movement there is during the rest period. And so here are just some general findings. In our adult bipolar 1 participants, this is the largest sample we had as an adult, and they tend towards later timing for peak activity and mid-sleep. So they're essentially shifted in their phase of when they're going to bed and when they're waking up. They also tended to sleep longer, and this is actually something that's also been found in other studies in the United States. And so it's interesting that we see confirmation of these patterns in this very different population. So what happens in adolescence? Well, given the really extensive phenotypic and genomic characterization we've done in adult pedigree members, we were also interested in whether we can investigate these phenotypes developmentally in the adolescent offspring. And I've already talked about these changes that occur during adolescence and why this is an interesting time period. So the other thing I want to point out is just in terms of the phenomenology of the initial mania prodrome, sleep changes are actually the most common prodrome of mania and among the most common prodromes of depression. So this is really, I think, an important aspect of the disorder to investigate very early on as a potential predictor, a potential biomarker. And so just to start out, we looked at, and again, this is a pilot study, so it's a small sample so far, but just looking at the diagnoses in these children of bipolar parents, we see that there are very high rates of a number of diagnoses, but particularly anxiety disorder and ADHD. And this is really interesting in that it's very consistent with other high-risk studies that have been done in the US and Europe, which indicate greatly elevated rates of psychiatric disorders. Not necessarily a mood disorder. They do have some dysthymia, some major depression, but really it's a very broad spectrum of psychopathology that we see in these adolescent children of bipolar parents. And a couple of interesting findings that we're seeing, a couple of interesting patterns, we see that there is greater stability of daily rhythms that's associated with, so in other words, having a more consistent pattern of daily rhythms, and this was determined by the actigraphy, was associated with lower self-reported stress. So the more consistent you are, the less self-reported stress. And we also saw that a relationship between greater family conflict, this was a self-report measure, a conflict behavior questionnaire, and this was associated with poorer memory in these high-risk adolescents. The sample is still pretty small, but these correlations are very robust. Now, one key question that you may have, and which is a very good question, is what is the direction of effect here? And right now, we're just looking at cross-sectional data. We're just looking at a snapshot. And so one of the things we're very interested in doing is a longitudinal prospective study looking at predictors over time of the development of mood symptoms. And so this is just a potential example of how something like this might work. So given the likely involvement of circadian disruption in the pathophysiology of bipolar illness, let's just take for an example, a mutation in a clock gene may disrupt sleep. and thus may have a cascading effect on environmental factors, resulting in increased irritability, more hostile family interactions, and increased stress in the family system, which could lead to changes in the brain and essentially this feedback loop that leads to increased symptomatology. And of course, we don't think that a mutation in the clock gene it's actually causing bipolar disorder, because we know that there are multiple genes involved in the disorder. But this is just an example of the kinds of gene-environment interactions that which may be at play. And so hopefully we'll be able to investigate that further in a longitudinal study. So just in the last part, I want to mention a few things about the clinical implications of these findings. And so it really does point to a lot of lifestyle interventions that might be effective. So we know that in adults with major depressive disorder, there's increasing evidence for the effectiveness of alternative therapies, things like yoga, tai chi, exercise. So not necessarily pharmacologic treatments. There's also work from Ellen Frank at Pittsburgh showing that social rhythm therapy is effective for adults with bipolar disorder. And so the idea of this is really that individuals with bipolar disorder have a genetic predisposition to sleep-wake cycle abnormalities that may be related to the symptomatic manifestations, and life events could disrupt social rhythms. And so a big part of this intervention is really regularizing daily routines, also diminishing interpersonal problems that can disrupt these schedules. And so basically scheduling consistency is something that can really help reduce symptomatology. And so for adolescents, having a regular sleep schedule, avoiding that variability and avoiding, I know this is a challenge for parents to avoid overscheduling of adolescents, but it is something that is helpful in terms of regularizing the schedule. Also things like limiting caffeine intake and screen time, particularly at night. So in terms of helping adolescents and young adults with mood disorders succeed, there are in fact a lot of psychosocial interventions that can be highly effective in symptom reduction and improving functioning, sometimes in conjunction with medication. But my colleague David Miklowitz has a really wonderful book about a family-focused treatment approach to bipolar disorder. There are also a number of educational recommendations if you have a child with bipolar disorder. And having an individualized education plan is really key, making sure that your child has appropriate homework and testing accommodations, and things like behavior and mood charts can be really helpful. Accommodations potentially for sleep disturbance, like a shortened school day or a later start to a school day, could also be a really helpful intervention. And this is a link to a website that has some very helpful tips on school behavior for children with mood disorders. So just to summarize, we know that adolescence is a period of brain plasticity and major structural reorganization. And we think that this asynchrony in developmental time courses between the frontal regions of the brain involved in higher order cognition and planning and the subcortical structures involved in things like reward can be potentially related to the development of mood disorders during this time period. We know that cognitive deficits, particularly verbal learning and memory, as well as attention, are an important treatment target in youth with bipolar disorder. Sleep disruption is a risk factor for the development of mood disorders, and certainly is something that might exaggerate the normative imbalance that we see in adolescence between affective and cognitive control systems. Also, our preliminary data shows links between daily rhythm stability and stress, as well as between family conflict and mood and cognition. So we think all of these things are interrelated, and we know that psychosocial and lifestyle interventions can be very effective in improving some of these aspects. So with that, I'm just going to thank all of my colleagues on our Latin American project and thank our funding sources who supported the work, and I will stop there for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carrie, for all of your information and insight. And I have one question to start here. And please feel free to email me if you're unable to use this control panel, dbrown@ibpf.org, and I will get those questions to Carrie. The first question is, did any of the studies look at the amount of blue light that teens were subjected to before bed?
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that. I am not aware of studies that have specifically looked at that in teens, but I think you're absolutely right. Just anecdotally, I have heard that the blue light is particularly problematic, and I believe there are different kinds of filters that you can use to reduce the blue light. So that may be something to look into. In general, I would suggest no screen time, an hour to an hour and a half before bed, just to avoid that blue light in particular.
Great, thank you. The next question, were there any differences in seasonal changes or surrounding bright light therapy implications?
Yeah, that's a great question. We certainly, so in our, one of the issues of doing work in Latin America is there's really not the kinds of seasons that you see in, in other places, the US and in Europe. And so one of the things that we were really interested in that we were not able to do was to compare, not able to do yet, I should say, was to compare to a population in Finland, because there I expect that we would see massive seasonal differences. And so there are, I think even in places like Colombia where there's not obvious seasonal changes or not dramatic seasonal changes, there are still diurnal patterns and seasonal patterns for individuals for their illness, where people will still report they tend to have manic episodes in the spring, even though I think it's not as pronounced because it's not associated with these major seasonal changes. But nevertheless, some of them still occur, which is interesting.
Excellent, thank you. Because teenagers seem to be late night folks, what is it? Is the late night problematic for them and getting up early, or is it okay for the late night to occur as long as that's regular pattern?
Yeah, it's really a challenge because there is this circadian shift that happens, as I mentioned, and so there's biologically teenagers are more inclined to go to sleep later, and yet there's this conflict because they have to get up early for school, and so a lot of teenagers are really not getting enough sleep, and so having a regular pattern is important, but the overall duration of sleep and how much sleep they're getting is also important. And it's interesting because this has led to some policy changes in some communities where the school start time has been made later. And it's fascinating. That's actually made a difference in terms of the number of accidents, car accidents and things like that in those communities. So there's actually some very convincing data that changing school start times it has a pretty big public health impact. But if you're not lucky enough to live in one of those places and your child needs to get up really early for school, then I think the best thing you can do is try to encourage them to get to bed earlier, at least as early as possible and at a consistent time.
So what is the number of hours that a teen requires?
8 hours is what's recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Of course, we realize that and it's tough. It's homework really gets in the way, and so that may not be realistic. But something between 7 and 8 hours, I think, is really critical.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question: did you consider adverse childhood experiences in the studies about being able to regulate emotions?
Yeah, so the work that I was talking about in Colombia is a pretty new exploratory study, and we are looking at adverse child experiences in that study. For some of the work that was done on the large scale studies of adolescents and sleep behaviors, probably those types of questions were not asked about, so I'm not aware of the impact of adverse child experiences in those studies. I think in our studies in Colombia, I don't know that we have enough data yet to really speak to that, but my guess would be that it's certainly going to be important as a risk factor.
Great, thank you. The next question is what can cause bad memory in teens? And I assume that's a child with bipolar disorder diagnosed.
Yeah. So it's a good question that I don't have a good answer to. The studies that have looked at this, it really tends to be fairly observational in terms of, okay, this is an area where they tend to have more difficulty. And that's also pretty consistent. I mean, we do see those similar kinds of memory impairments in people with other mental health disorders. So even adolescents with schizophrenia, for example, that tends to be a big area of deficit. And so what I would say is that it's the kind of domain, it's a kind of cognitive ability that really requires a lot of things. It requires being able to listen and pay attention. And so you have to have adequate attentional capacity, and then to be able to remember that information and repeat it back. So there's a number of different components, and you can see that it's a really important aspect for school. Being able to verbal memory is really pretty key. So certainly sleep disruption may be related. People in general have poor memory when they haven't gotten a good night's sleep. So that's certainly something that may be related to it. But in terms of what we can do about it, there are a number of educational recommendations in terms of sitting closer to the teacher, having it's possible to even get a note taker. First, some IEPs have accommodations like that. Audio recordings of classroom information and so forth. So there are a number of educational accommodations that can be put in place to help deal with that.
Great answer, thank you. It looks like that's all of the questions that we have currently, but again, if you think of something after the fact that you'd like Carrie to answer, please email me at dbrown@ibpf.org. And I'd be happy to forward that on. And thank you again, Carrie, for sharing your expertise with us today. Everyone,
my pleasure.
Have a great day, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everyone. Bye.